Chapter 33. School and Repairs. Aleah burst through the doors of Grove Academy, with Callum not far behind her. Her backpack was unzipped, and the books inside were clearly showing as it bounced, and she slowed to a stop. Callum's backpack also looked like it had been in a war zone. Their eyes shone with nervousness, but they didn't seem as bright as before. Their gazes thrashed around, looking for any possible witnesses, and found one. A shocked teacher stood near a group of lockers with a stack of untidy papers. She stared at them with a stiff posture that showed how surprised and startled she was. Aleah, her arm still causing much havoc, suddenly stood up straight and punched Callum's arm lightly. He snapped to attention, and they both smiled guiltily at the teacher, and Aleah asked, where is 10th grade right now? She asked with a perfect shy girl impression. The teacher adjusted her glasses on her face. They are in room 21, just down the hall. And no more running. You about gave me a heart attack, she exclaimed as she chuckled nervously and walked away. Aleah let out a sigh of relief and turned to Callum. Well, we are definitely late. She smiled at him, and he rolled his eyes. He began walking down the hall as he gestured wildly. I think that is the least of our problems, Aleah. They both laughed as quietly as they could as they snuck down the hall. They approached room 21, and Callum knocked on the door. The two of them heard a man yell, "Come in." Callum slowly opened the door and clutched his backpack strap. The male teacher looked at them with judgy eyes as the two of them took their seats. They finally show up. Nextari and Carolee. Why are you late today? He asked with a prideful tone. This teacher was extremely opinionated, and public humiliation was his favorite scare tactic and punishment philosophy. Aleah had always thought it was funny that her last name was Carolee. This made sense, though, because when Sam had signed Aleah into the school, he put her last name, as is on the form, although this wasn't technically true. It made her smile and Callum wince whenever they heard his last name called out. His last name was Nextari for now, because that was put on his form. She smiled at him from across the room and ignored the whispers from her classmates. Aleah raised her hand and waited for the teacher's approving nod. She answered, I was late for personal reasons that I don't feel are necessary to share with the class. Short answer is, we just happened to arrive late on the same time for different reasons. But I don't know why Callum was late. She smirked and looked at Callum. Callum pressed his lips together and realized that she had thrown him under the bus. Aleah knew that he hated this teacher and really disliked interacting with him, so she must have said that on purpose to force him to talk to the teacher. The teacher squinted at Aleah. Class, what are the chances that Carolee slept in and didn't think that arriving on time was important? He asked the room. The kids began snickering, and one answered, very high, with eagerness in his voice. Aleah sighed because she wasn't too fond of this teacher herself. His punishment style was annoying and simply unnecessary, but she knew standing up to him would just draw unwanted attention to herself, which she was trying to avoid. Callum cleared his throat and explained, I was late because I had to help someone with some issues. He looked directly at Aleah, and it took a little longer than expected. He looked at the teacher, waiting impatiently for his answer. Aleah's jaw dropped, but she now considered it even between the two of them as she crossed her arms. Callum chuckled a little and contently leaned back in his chair as the teacher waved him off. He looked up at the class and commanded, You kids know what your next assignment is, and it's on the board, so get on it. He looked back at his computer as the class groaned and brought out their textbooks. Aleah had already completed the work because she had worked ahead during her free time in class. Callum, however, began writing with his pencil because he wasn't as smart as Aleah with his time. Aleah, bored, looked up at the ceiling as she looked for something interesting. The white-painted ceiling had small bumps that looked like the pebbles encased on the sidewalk. Her gaze traveled around the room as she noticed more details of the room. The teacher was constantly staring at his computer screen or occasionally scribbling down things on a notepad. The corners of the room were covered in spider webs that the teacher just didn't have the willpower to get rid of. The paint on the edges of the walls was cracking and turning yellow, reflecting the poor conditions of the room. Aleah could hear the whispers of Rosalind and her crew from the back of the room and decided to ignore them because it was probably just gossip that didn't really matter to a Sentiron in disguise. It was mostly quiet, and she could hear someone practicing violin nearby. The melody was clearly unexperienced, but was beautiful enough to soothe Aleah and make her really listen to it. Then, she turned around and noticed that Madeline was missing. She took violin lessons during this time, and Aleah was sure that the beautiful sound she was hearing was the red-haired girl's handiwork. It was a pure melody that Aleah thought was very impressive for their age. Time passed as Aleah reluctantly watched the clock. The bell rang, and the teenagers flowed out of the room and into the hallway. Aleah made her way to the next classroom of the day, getting pushed and shoved by many people in the hallway. Students would get physically moved, but teachers seemed to have a ring of space around them. Aleah set her backpack down near her seat and was about to go talk to Callum when she was surrounded by her friends. Casey spoke quickly and excitedly. "Aleah, did you see the news this morning? The green robot is back, and it was with the blue one this time. It got hurt in the shoulder and had telekinesis too." She balled her fists and shook them in front of her excitedly. Casey seemed dangerously interested in the newly discovered robots. Aleah shook her head. "I heard, but it really doesn't matter." "What did you do while I was gone from school lately?" she asked, but her question was ignored. Haley added, "Yeah, the encounter was recorded near the school. The machines might be near us. Doesn't that worry anyone? They seemed dangerous." She seemed worried, then shrugged. Aleah quickly answered, "I'm sure the robots wouldn't hurt any humans, or they would have done so by now. Besides, it really doesn't matter." She tried to distract them from the subject, but they refused to stray from it. Sadie shook her head. "Oh, come on, Aleah. Don't you think it's cool that such mysterious things are near us? If we walk through the woods or something, we might actually come across the green robot," she exclaimed. Aleah mumbled under her breath, "They're closer than you think." She couldn't help but think about how they didn't know that they were technically talking to the green robot. She instinctively clutched her shoulder when her arm knocked the desk behind her a little, inhaling through her teeth from the pain. Madeline, who had returned, tilted her head and asked, "Are you all right? You have been acting like your shoulder is killing you ever since you came late." Madeline looked down in thought, and Aleah began to panic. The gears in Madeline's head were starting to turn and connect the dots. Aleah looked around for help, but it was too late. Madeline asked, "Wait, were you there at the robot battle? You seemed disheveled when you arrived. Your shoulder is clearly hurting you, and that means you could have gotten some action. Wait, was Callum there too?" Oh, she co-ed. This accusation made the other girls crowd around Aleah with interest as they waited for her answer. Aleah felt herself getting nervous as she blushed and tried to explain, No, not at all. I simply fell and did something to my shoulder on the way here, that's all. Callum just happened to get here at the same time." She looked at the girls and hoped this explanation was enough for them. To Aleah's relief, they all backed up and sighed. Haley asked, "What did you do to your arm?" she asked, pressing Aleah. Aleah backed up a little because she was running out of excuses. She struggled and combed through ideas, trying to find one that made sense. It was a break in the school day, so Aleah had 10 minutes until the actual bell rang, which meant more time to try dodge questions. Suddenly, all of the girls backed up a little, and they looked at the floor. Aleah didn't understand why until she looked up and saw Rosalind and her two friends standing inside the circle of girls. Aleah's face fell into annoyance as Rosalind sneered. "You're back again. I was hoping you had gotten expelled. Oh well." She tauntingly smirked at Aleah as the disguised Sentiron thought about how to get rid of the nuisance before her. Aleah stepped forward and the two girls' chests almost touched. "And I was hoping you would have learned from our latest encounter, Rosalind." "What do you want this time?" she asked, making sure that her comments felt like bullets. Rosalind cocked her head to the side and answered, "I was just wondering what you were doing coming in with my man." "What was that about anyway, Aleah?" she asked with a prideful tone. Aleah felt her cheeks heat up and her body tense. The mention of Callum made her thoughts scramble, and she felt anger bubbling to the surface. Aleah clenched her jaw and leaned in more, but didn't get the chance to answer. Aleah felt at ease when Callum appeared behind Rosalind. He looked down at the bully and tilted his head in confusion. "What is this I'm hearing?" he asked. He glanced up at Aleah as if to reassure her, as Rosalind whipped around. She looked up at Callum with a cunning smile and placed her hand against his chest. "Hi again, Callum. Did you finally come to see me?" she asked with a slow tone. Callum squinted at her, then at Aleah, and finally realized what was happening. Callum peeled Rosalind's hand off of him and moved her to the side. Rosalind's jaw dropped as he leaned against the desk and put his arm around Aleah. "Rosalind, I am not yours." Aleah, though, he leaned down, looked at Aleah's bright green eyes, and smiled. He touched her forehead with his, and they both chuckled a little. Aleah's face turned bright red, and she laughed awkwardly as Callum pulled her closer. She quickly recovered, though, and looked up at Callum, saying, "Oh, stop it. You're embarrassing me." She smiled at him in return. He laughed as she pushed his head away from her, and Rosalind stomped her foot. She exclaimed, "Ugh, whatever. He isn't even that cute anyway." She stormed out of the room, and both Aleah and Callum started laughing uncontrollably. Aleah, once she had composed herself, got Callum's attention. "She is such a nuisance. But she is right about one thing. You aren't cute." She stared at Callum, and he furrowed his brows, confused and slightly hurt. Then Aleah continued, "You're not just cute. You're more than that." She smiled widely at him, and he hugged her tightly, chuckling a little. Callum looked up when he heard his name called by 3 male voices. 3 boys about his age laughed and walked up to him. The first one had blonde hair and tall stature. He raised his arm out to his side. Callum did the same, smiling widely as their hands hit, and they pulled each other into a hug. The boy patted Callum's back and dragged him along as he walked away, followed by the other 2 boys. Aleah looked relaxed and assumed that they were Callum's friends. After the boys were out of listening range, Aleah felt a pair of hands grab hers. Casey was holding her hands and shaking them violently as the whole group squealed. Oh, are you 2 dating now?" she exclaimed, and waited for Aleah's response. Aleah didn't mind answering this question. "I guess so." The whole group erupted in cheers and were high-fiving each other as they celebrated for Aleah. The green-eyed girl smiling longingly. Then another thought came to her mind. Aleah glanced at the clock, and it showed 5 more minutes until the period started. She rushed out, still clutching her shoulder, and managed to elude her friend group. She speedily walked down the halls to the room where she knew she would find the 8th grade. She peered in, making sure nothing was abnormal, but was caught. Aleah felt a pair of hands on her shoulders rip her around. Aleah cried out in pain, knocking the hand off of one of her shoulders since the pain was barely tolerable. She looked up through squinted, pained eyes and saw Lila's concerned face. They walked in the door, and Aleah was caught off guard by how nostalgic it felt. She remembered sitting on the bench next to the wall and having a panic attack. It gave her chills, and the hair on the back of her neck stood up. Lila dropped her persona and exclaimed, "Aleah, is Lockjaw all right?" She sounded panicked. Aleah reassured her. "Yes, he's here actually." As Callum, of course. She felt a wave of pain hit her arm, and she clutched her shoulder. Lila lowered her head and stretched her hand out sympathetically. "Your shoulder, what happened?" she asked. Aleah sighed as the pain subsided. "One of the soldiers got me and about pulled my arm off. It's gone now, though, all of them are. I'm just happy to see you got here safely." She put her healthy hand on Lila's shoulder, relieved that the human was all right. Aleah, now assured that her 2 friends were mostly uninjured, let her sympathetic expression fall. Lila asked, "Also, I have something to ask. Why in the world were you on the news again?" she exclaimed with concern. Aleah's eyes widened as she realized that she had forgotten about that. Aleah gestured wildly. "Lila, as you saw, Lockjaw and I were in a tough situation and couldn't fight and hide ourselves at the same time. I actually focused on the news a little bit, and that's when the soldier damaged my arm. Now, I'm glad you escaped safely, but don't judge me for my choices because it was either fight in the open or let those next Hari kill the news people and us. And you're welcome because I saved your life, Lila," she explained with an annoyed tone. Lila shook her head in submission. "Fine, but you better hope that Silver Spot didn't see the news. She will kill you if she did. Aleah, you, and Callum both." She waved Aleah off and walked out. As the door closed behind Lila, she said, "The bell's about to ring. You should get back to class, too." She slammed the door behind her. The tiles of the bathroom floor were cracked and made Aleah's feet bend a little when she walked. She walked up to the mirror and sighed as she examined herself. The mirror showed a tall, lean girl with long, auburn hair that waved on the ends. Her eyes were an unnatural green that seemed to glow a little, and her outfit was black and green. She thought about how bad it would be if the news, military, or to the next Hari found out about her and Callum's transformation ability. Aleah huffed and decided to return to class and face the rest of the day. She walked down the quiet halls and heard the bell ring. She practically ran to class so she wouldn't be late. When she finally walked in the doors, the teacher sighed and her classmates sneered. Aleah couldn't believe just how crazy a few high school children could be. They all were manipulative, had potty mouths, or were straight-up menaces. The only exception were the girls in her friend group. They were kind of cut off from the rest of the class socially, so they didn't exactly match the toxic traits of the others, and Aleah found comfort in that. She would risk her life for any human, but sometimes these creatures could be downright as evil as the next Hari themselves. That was a hard lesson that Aleah had to learn early in her life. Some are evil and can't be saved. Some are evil but are still worth rescuing. Ribe, however, was ready to attack at any time and, lately, had not done much damage. This gave Aleah anxiety because she knew that Ribe was planning something but couldn't prove it. Aleah took her seat and the rest of the day seemed like a blur. Before she knew it, the final bell had rung and she was walking out of the school doors beside Callum and Lila. Aleah didn't have her backpack on because her shoulder had gotten worse. Callum had offered to carry it, and the boy was now holding an extra backpack as they walked. Aleah continuously clutched her shoulder as they walked down the long sidewalk beside bustling cars. Aleah clenched her jaw and said, "I really need to change back. My shoulder hurts so bad." She looked forward as she remembered the unspoken rule. Whenever a Sentiron was injured and turned into a human, which for now only applied to Saberclaw and Lockjaw, they didn't have the physical injury and just had the pain. However, the pain would intensify and the wound would get worse, eventually forcing the robot to return to their original form. Aleah sighed heavily and walked beside Callum, hoping for comfort from him. Callum, sensing her need, inched closer and said, "Let's get out of sight, then you and I can change back." He reached behind Aleah and rubbed her uninjured shoulder. Aleah leaned her head to the side and rested it on Callum as they walked. Callum continuously ran his fingers through her smooth hair. After a few minutes, they arrived at the end of the driveway. The trees blocked any sight from the road, so Aleah and Callum changed back. Saberclaw kneeled and grabbed her shoulder, crying out from the pain. Her shoulder armor stuck out in certain areas that weren't normal. Lockjaw quickly helped Saberclaw back on her feet, and they walked the last few yards down the driveway. For more speed, Lockjaw scooped Lila into his hand, and they eventually arrived at the hangar. Saberclaw's shoulder looked terrifying and extremely painful as she held it carefully. The burning sensation was not bearable, and Saberclaw constantly huffed and groaned as she tried to cope. Silver Spot met them at the entrance with a smile that was quickly wiped away when she saw Saberclaw. Silver Spot's face fell. "Oh no. Saber, what did you do this time?" she asked with concern. Silver Spot carefully placed her hands on Saberclaw's arm, and the green robot winced from the pain. Silver Spot guided Saberclaw down the hall and into the medical bay. Saberclaw sat on the counter-like bed and let Silver Spot examine her. Lockjaw stood close, but not close enough to be in Silver Spot's way. As time passed, Silver Spot's face became graver. The medic turned away and picked up a few tools as she gave her diagnosis. "The main armor and skeleton is dislocated. Good news, I can fix it without difficulty. Bad news, Lockjaw, you might have to hold Saberclaw down." She frowned and sighed with a heavy tone. Lockjaw's expression changed as he looked at Saberclaw with concerned shock. Saberclaw's head snapped towards Silver Spot as she put the tools down again. "What is that supposed to mean?" She sounded anxious. Silver Spot smiled guiltily and walked closer, making Saberclaw jump. "It is probably better that you don't understand then. Lockjaw, come here." I'll need help because of her strength. She pushed down on Saberclaw's chest and forced her to lay completely on the medical table. Lockjaw nervously obeyed and questioned, I think I understand, but I really don't want to participate in this. He was clearly uneasy as Silver Spot grabbed his hand. She looked up at him and shrugged. Well, I can't do it on my own, and Razorwing is still on patrol. She placed his hand on Saberclaw's chest and placed his other hand on her lower torso near her hips. Lockjaw's touch made Saberclaw relax a little, but she didn't like how his hands were placed on her. Silver Spot was leaning over her and moving her hands closer to Saber's shoulder. She had limited movement now and noticed her legs being held down by Lockjaw as well. She finally figured it out, but didn't have time to speak her opinion before she felt Silver Spot's hand on her shoulder. Silver Spot ripped Saberclaw's shoulder towards herself, and Saberclaw yelled from the pain. Her whole body jerked, and a loud snapping could be heard throughout the base. Saberclaw's jaw dropped, then clenched again as the burning sensation was replaced with shock and extreme agony. Her scream was insanely loud, and Lockjaw had to put his entire weight on her to keep her in place as she jerked. He closed his eyes and turned away, convincing himself that this was good for Saberclaw. Silver Spot sighed out of pity and began putting pressure on the wound. Saberclaw groaned as the pain faded a little, but it was definitely still sore. Silver Spot nodded to Lockjaw, and he released Saberclaw. The robot writhed, and she clenched her shoulder, hoping for any kind of relief. Silver Spot grabbed a chunk of metal that looked like some sort of skeleton. Saberclaw had turned on her side, while looking for a more comfortable position, so Silver Spot had to grab Saberclaw's side and move her on her back again. Silver Spot sympathized. I know, Saber. You'll thank me later. She emotionlessly strapped the metal cage around Saberclaw's arm and tightened it around her shoulder. Between groans, Saberclaw yelled, What do you mean? That was terrible. Now I'm going to have trust issues for the rest of my life. Silver. She was extremely angry, but felt the pain slowly quenching itself. Silver Spot laughed a little. Saber, like I said, you'll thank me later. She helped Saberclaw sit up again, and Lockjaw, seeing that she was finally all right, rushed to her side. He squeezed her hand and said, Are you okay? Is your shoulder still hurting? He asked, clearly concerned. Saberclaw, still in a foul mood, glared at him as she spat. No, you idiot. It feels like my shoulder was put through a Sentiron-sized meat grinder. She threw her head back, groaning as she also squeezed his hand. Then, she looked down at the brace on her arm. It was gray and made of strong metal. She could move her hand, but the rest was cemented in place. This also was unfortunate because she couldn't access her dagger or her blaster on that arm. Now, she could only use her left arm. Silver Spot, as if reading Saberclaw's mind, added, You will be off of the battlefield for a little while, and you will feel pain during that time, but it will get better. I'm sure Lockjaw and Razorwing can handle the battle for now. Silver Spot's mention of Razorwing made Saberclaw snap out of her painful daze and remember the chain still in her backpack. She hopped off of the operating table and began quickly walk out of the room. Lockjaw, stunned, followed and asked, Saber, I thought you felt like your shoulder was in a meat grinder? You're already up and walking. He was very confused. She didn't look back at him as she answered, No, believe me, it still does. But I'm on a mission right now, so it doesn't matter. She walked down the hallway with Lockjaw trailing behind her, still confused, but not questioning her anymore. She reached the entrance of the hangar where she had dropped her backpack, and they had left Aleah. The girl sat, braced up against a wall with both Aleah's and Callum's backpacks, as she worked on homework. Lila glanced up from her books and saw Saberclaw walking closer, her large footsteps shaking the earth. Lila dropped what she was doing and shot up to her feet. Saber, your arm. Are you okay? She asked, but continued. I heard your scream, by the way. I want to know what happened because you sounded like you had been stabbed. She watched as Saberclaw didn't make eye contact. Saberclaw used two of her fingers from her left hand to gently unzip the backpack and stuffed her pointer finger into the large pocket. Her metal finger was so large that she struggled to grab the chain. She finally managed to get the chain out and lift it over her head gently. She began fidgeting with the chain and said, Actually, it definitely wasn't as bad as getting stabbed, but it still felt like pure agony. Silver Spot put my arm back where it was supposed to be and put this cast thing on it, so I won't be able to fight or become human for a few days until my arm figures out how to work again. She huffed with frustration, but Lila chuckled a little. The girl found it ironic that Saberclaw actually knew what it felt like to be stabbed, even though that was supposed to be an exaggerated comparison, and the robot took it as a real question. Just then, a loud thumping and clanking sound of footsteps rapidly came near them. Saberclaw and Lockjaw instinctively snapped into battle positions. Lockjaw spread his wings defensively and shoved Saberclaw backwards, causing her to stumble and almost fall over. He looked outside, and his blaster glowed with a deadly aura. Razorwing's body flew onto the scene as he slid to a stop, his clanking feet silenced when he stopped running. Lockjaw instantly yelled, "Friendly," and put his blaster away as his body relaxed again. Razorwing put his hands in front of his chest and exaggerated sarcastically, "Don't shoot. I'm not a Nextari. Unlike someone," he mumbled as he passed Lockjaw, slapping the large, blue wings out of his way. Lockjaw, hearing this comment, let his jaw drop and he defensively said, "Razorwing, I can't believe you still haven't gotten over that. I was under literal mind control." He flailed his arms and gestured. Razorwing waved Lockjaw off as the blue robot sighed. Lockjaw used his wing to knock Razorwing in the back of the head. Razorwing whipped around and raised his hand to his head as he rubbed the stricken area. He glared at Lockjaw and angrily commented, "Really? I couldn't tell. You still act like a Nextari." He pressed his lips together, but felt a hand slap the side of his face. The fingers felt thinner and less powerful than Lockjaw, so Razorwing assumed who it was. Saberclaw poked her head around Razorwing's flared wings and glared at him as she brought her body around him. Lockjaw attempted to contain his laugh as Saberclaw pointed an accusing finger at Razorwing as he held the side of his face. "Razor, don't you dare say that because Lockjaw had proved to be loyal. Get a hold of yourself," she scolded, and he submissively backed off and moved his wings out of her way. Lockjaw put his hands up innocently when Saberclaw's angry gaze landed on him. She exclaimed, "And you don't just shove me out of the way when there's any sort of danger. I can defend myself and will slap you if you do it again. Got it?" She prompted with angry eyes and pressed lips. Lockjaw nodded his head and immediately shrank his wings back behind him. "Yes, ma'am." He managed to control his laugh and hide it safely. He knew that if he wanted to live, he shouldn't laugh at Saberclaw's threats. Saberclaw was probably one of the only ones who could control Lockjaw like this, not including mind control, of course. If anyone else threatened him like that, he would make sure that Silver Spot had to repair them. Saberclaw turned to Razorwing again and asked, "So, why did you come in such a rush?" Her tone and demeanor had completely changed. She sounded sweet and curious after scolding him coldly. Razorwing cautiously answered, You were hurt. As soon as I heard, I came running. But now, you seem fine except for that brace." He pointed to the metal skeleton holding her arm in place. Saberclaw looked down at it and held it in front of her face. "Oh, I just dislocated it, and it was agony getting it put back. I'm okay now, just sore." She fidgeted with her chain as Razorwing looked at it with a content smile. Lockjaw walked closer, feeling rather jealous of the way Razorwing was looking at Saberclaw. His wing brushed hers, and she jumped a little, then glanced at him when she realized he wasn't a danger. She looked back at Razorwing as he sighed. "That makes me feel better. How long will you be recovering?" he asked. Saberclaw gestured wildly and rolled her eyes, about to answer. Saberclaw opened her mouth, but someone else's voice spoke in place of her own. They all turned around and looked where the voice had come from. Silver Spot, who had walked in, had answered, "She won't be doing anything strenuous for at least a few days. Until I think she is battle-ready again, that is." Her presence calmed everyone like a mother to her children. Silver Spot approached them, her wings tidily tucked behind her back and her hips swinging a little confidently. She stood beside Saberclaw and looked at her with a proud smile. Saberclaw was almost twice Silver Spot's size, and this made Saberclaw feel it was of utmost importance that she took care of the medic. Saberclaw's wing wrapped around Silver Spot, and the silver medic gasped in surprise as Saberclaw pulled her closer. Saberclaw hugged Silver Spot and said, "Thanks, Silver. I know you've always got my back." She smiled at Silver Spot, and the robot flapped her own wings, shifting herself out of Saberclaw's grasp. She chuckled and proudly answered, "See, I told you that you would thank me later. I declare, I am rarely wrong when it comes to you three." She dusted her hands off and looked at Lila with expectancy. Lila looked up at the four robots before her in awe. They were each at least 2 stories tall and made of pure metal. They all were humanoid with large wings that helped them show their emotions. She had gotten used to their ground-shaking, clanking footsteps, but she still couldn't believe the size of them in all their glory when they stood just feet away from her. She had to look straight up to meet eyes with them, and she felt her father's strange obsession with technology that she seemed to have inherited kick in. She smiled excitedly at the Sentiron and silently thanked the universe for giving her such an interesting, action-filled life. Saberclaw smiled and looked at Lila with intention. "So, do you want to spend the day together because I can't do anything else?" she asked. Lila looked up at her with curiosity, but was clearly excited. "Do I?" "Of course," she smiled from ear to ear. Saberclaw clapped her hands together, then lowered her open palm for Lila to climb into. Lila stepped on Saberclaw's hands, and the girl was forced into a sitting position as Saberclaw raised her upwards. Saberclaw turned to the others and jokingly said, "Ha! See you later, suckers." She made sure Lila was secure. Then she turned away and walked out, leaving Silver Spot, Razorwing, and Lockjaw alone. Lockjaw, still staring out of the base with concern, leaned his head towards Silver Spot and asked, "Is it okay for her to do that? Won't she just hurt herself again?" He sounded worried, but a little lighthearted at the same time. Silver Spot shrugged. "I do not know of her plans, so it is impossible for me to tell. However, I'm sure she will have fun at her own risk, Lockjaw." And she pointed to him as if reading his mind. "I suggest not following her. She will not be happy if you're stalking her constantly." He lowered his shoulders and dramatically threw his head back as he groaned impatiently. Razorwing shook his head at this and followed Silver Spot as she walked away towards the hallway again. Silver Spot called to the other two, "Well, I'm going to experiment with the synthetic G if you two don't mind. Now, don't bother me." She exited the main hangar, leaving Lockjaw and Razorwing alone. Please leave a like and subscribe to my channel. I appreciate it.